MotoE has been getting better and better over the years, but did you know it wouldn't even exist if it weren't for a failed series that no one talks about? This series was supposed to revolutionize racing. Instead, it was completely abandoned and forgotten. So what went wrong? Well, in this video, we'll go through how this race series failed, how it paved the way for MotoE, and what MotoE actually is. Let's dive in. To actually learn how MotoE became a thing, we need to go back to 2013. One of the first major ventures in electric motorbike racing was the FIM E-Road World Cup. It was actually created when a company called TTXGP and the FIM merged together. TTXGP actually did some really interesting stuff in the world of motorbike racing, and I'm going to touch on those in a second. The bikes used in this series were a bit of a mixture. It wasn't just a one-make series. Surprisingly, multiple different bikes were used in the E-Road Racing World Cup. A lot of experience had actually come from the E-Power International series, which by the way wasn't actually all that popular. Take a look at this video here. This was the grid for the season opener of the 2011 E-Power series. Yep, that is the entire grid, just 3 riders. Anyways, the FIM E-Road Racing World Cup and the other electric motorbike racing series at the time use the Munk TTE2, the Agni Z1, Bravo's Impulse RR, Zero SR, and the Energica Ego. The last bike, by the way, is a pretty key part of the rest of the video, so keep an eye out for that one. The specs and most of the statistics are actually really hard to find, but a few sources say they could do around 0 to 60 in about 3 seconds. These weren't slow by any means, but they were early adopters in the world of electric motorbike racing. Remember, conventional internal combustion engine motorbikes have been used and raced for over 100 years, so there was still a little bit of catching up to do. So what was the whole point of racing these bikes in the first place? Well, the FIM wanted to turn the World Cup into a fully fledged World Championship. Their initial plan for the 2013 season was to have 9 rounds in total. There was going to be 4 in Europe, 4 in North America, and then a grand final in Asia. Unfortunately, it all failed miserably for a couple of different reasons, which I'll touch on in a moment. But let's quickly go over what TTXGP did before the merge. TTXGP was founded by Azhar Hussain and Harsh Patel, and along with engineer Peter Hindley and a chap named Brian Hammond, they proposed the first ever electric race event held at the infamous Isle of Man TT in 2009. Keep in mind, the Isle of Man TT circuit is 37 miles long, so it wasn't going to be a multi-lap event that people were used to. The technology just wasn't there for the bikes to be able to do much more than that. So instead, they held a 1-lap race with the entire concept being not using carbon-based fuels. The first race in 2009 was somewhat popular. 20 people entered the event, and in all honesty, it was actually some pretty good momentum to build on. But for 2010, the Isle of Man decided that they wanted to do their own electric motorbike racing event called TT0, and they left TTXGP to do something completely different. One of which was actually partnering with the FIM to create a World Cup. But initially, it didn't go ahead. The reason why was because the FIM wanted the entire rules and regulations book that TTXGP had created. When TTXGP refused, the FIM went and created their own series. That was the E-Power series which I talked about earlier. You know, the one that was not that popular at all. The owners of TTXGP decided to run a series on their own in parallel to the FIM's E-Power series, and they held races over Europe and North America. It was a semi-success. It was certainly more popular than the E-Power series that the FIM were doing, and it seemed by all accounts a little bit more grassroots, which is actually something that a lot of people seem to prefer. Fast forward to 2012, the FIM and TTXGP decided to merge once again, to form the FIM E-Road Racing World Cup. A big part of it was to be able to unify electric motorbike racing. Being able to bring more riders onto the grid surely wasn't a bad thing, and ultimately both companies wanted to push electric motorbike racing forward, so surely this should have been a success. Well, this is where it all started to go wrong. Remember earlier I said they proposed a 9-round championship for the 2013 season. Well, there were lots of logistical troubles and general lack of time to find alternative venues after cancellations, which meant only 6 events took place. There were 4 in Europe and 2 in North America. Because there was no grand final held in Asia, they actually split the championship into 2 series, one for North America and one for Europe, so 2 champions were crowned in 2013. All in all, it was a little bit of a mess, but all good things must start from somewhere. All they needed to do was build on that momentum from the series in 2013. The FIM actually had a roadmap to turn this World Cup into a full World Championship by 2015. The reason they couldn't do it straight away is because you can't simply call yourself a World Championship. You need to be given that title. There's loads of different criteria that you need to meet. Things like the amount of countries your series is held in, the amount of events that you run, and how many participants actually take part. There's loads of other things that you have to hit, but those are just some of them. Unfortunately, it just couldn't get past the first season. In 2014, after the hype had died down and funds had dried up, the entire race series was abandoned. Trying to find any information on this is insanely hard. There just doesn't seem to be a legacy at all. So for the time being at least, electric motorbike racing was dead. And nothing happened for 4 years. That is, until 2018. On the 6th of February 2018, the FIM gave details on a brand new electric racing series, and they initially had some really ambitious goals. Here's just a few of the things that the FIM wanted to set for their all-new electric racing series. They wanted a total of 18 riders, they wanted 10-lap races, and they wanted 5 events in total. But they also wanted MotoGP, Moto3 and Moto2 teams to take part. So, a pretty bold venture. But this time though, they had help from Dorna. If you don't know who they are, they run and organise MotoGP, Moto2 and Moto3. With all of this back in, it seemed like a much more promising venture. In their press release, they also went on about how MotoE had a unique sound which they were bringing to racing, which they absolutely did. But what do you prefer? This? Or this? So, with backing from Dorna, the FIM Enel MotoE World Cup was created. But something disastrous happened a few weeks before the first round was supposed to kick off, and it jeopardized the entire series. Let me explain. Moving bikes from race to race is a really complex task. You've also got to consider other things like the team, the parts, the riders, the hospitality suites, you name it. There's so much you need to consider. With the MotoE circus, you have to consider all of the fast charging stations as well. And for the pre-season testing at Jerez, they stored everything in a temporary building. According to reports, a short circuit from some component caused a huge fire, which destroyed literally every bike for the MotoE series. All of them gone. Everything you can imagine for the season opener simply didn't exist anymore, and the first race was only 5 weeks away. There was nothing that could be done to get the bikes ready in time. So the FIM and Dorna postponed the first round, and they came out with a revised calendar. I'll talk a little bit more about the bikes that MotoE use a little bit later in this video, but the revised calendar ended up being 5 rounds with a double header at the finale held in Valencia. Remember I said earlier about a couple of interesting rules and formats that MotoE used? Well, one of them was their one-shot e-pole qualifying. It was effectively a shootout for quali. Riders had 1 lap to set their time. That 1 lap would decide the starting order. It's actually something that I would prefer to see in a few more motorsport events. Anyways, the first round was held at the German GP in 2019. And the racing was really close, but it was cut short after an enormous crash by Savadori, which ended the race prematurely. Although it did show some promise, and the rest of the season was the same. It was good, close, hard racing, which is exactly what you want. So let's talk a little bit more about the bikes. Remember earlier I talked about the Energica motorbikes that were racing almost a decade ago? Well, they were selected to be the sole supplier of the new bikes for MotoE. And these bikes were fast. Have a look at this video here. This is a MotoGP bike and a MotoE bike having a quick drag race. There isn't that much difference, if any, in the initial acceleration. A big part of the reason why they accelerate so fast is the amount of torque they provide from 0 RPM. It's one of the benefits of electric vehicles. It's why you've probably seen Teslas and other family electric cars absolutely smoke million-dollar hypercars more than once. Another benefit is because the bikes are heavier than a MotoGP bike, they provide more traction. Bottom line is, they're not slow. They do 0 to 60 in around 2.5 seconds. That's literally insane. The Energica Ego bikes had around 120 kilowatts of power, could hit somewhere around 270 kilometers an hour, and had around 200 newton meters of torque. They're all steel frames and had some pretty beefy 330mm discs. The batteries themselves were lithium ion, but a huge problem with the bike is the weight. They weigh a staggering 260 to 280 kilos. For reference, a MotoGP bike weighs around 160 kilos. So you could add a MotoGP bike and a Moto3 bike and you still wouldn't get the same weight. They were really fast in a straight line, but the problem was through the corners. They're about the same pace as a Moto3 bike. Alright, so we've learned about the history and the way that MotoE was founded, and we've also learned about the bikes that are used. But let's look at some of the changes that have happened over the years in MotoE. 2020 was the second year of the MotoE World Cup. It was still just a European Championship at this point. Remember, no World Championship status, but the bikes became faster and the races became slightly longer. And this was the same for 2021. The racing and MotoE itself gained popularity, and it simply got better. There were more races on the calendar and more bikes joined the grid. By 2022, the MotoE roster had grown to 6 different locations with 12 races in total. They also ditched the one-shot qualifying in favour of a more conventional qualifying format. But in 2023, MotoE managed to finally secure World Championship status. Ducati also became the sole supplier of the motorbikes for MotoE, and the calendar was made up of 16 different races. It's pretty staggering how far these bikes have come in a pretty short space of time. And in all honesty, I don't know how long it's going to be before they do become as quick as MotoGP. Let me know what you think in the comments. And to be honest, every other series is advancing really quickly as well. Take MotoGP for example. You can learn more about how some of the innovations have happened over the years by clicking on this video here. Thanks for watching, make sure you subscribe.